"Get your hands away from that instrument." Brienne Ashgrove's voice sliced through the ballroom like a cracked bell, and every conversation within 30 feet died instantly. Seren Caldwell stood frozen beside the grand piano, her fingertips barely resting against the polished mahogany lid. She had not meant to stop walking. She had not meant to touch anything. But the instrument had pulled at something buried deep inside her chest, something she thought she had starved to death years ago, and for one unguarded moment, her hand had drifted toward it the way a lost traveler reaches toward firelight. The laughter came first from Cressida, seated beneath the chandelier, with her fiancé's arm draped across the back of her chair. Then Anthea covered her smile with a silk glove, her shoulders trembling with amusement. Brienne, the youngest and cruelest of the three Ashgrove sisters, did not bother hiding anything. "Did you see that?" she announced to the guests surrounding her. The maid thought she could touch the piano. Soft laughter rippled across the ballroom. Crystal glasses paused mid-air. Several guests exchanged glances filled with second-hand embarrassment while Seren's face burned beneath the candlelight. Lady Lenora Ashgrove turned sharply from her conversation with the Countess of Belford, her expression tight with fury. "Seren, return to your duties immediately." "Forgive me, my lady." Seren's voice came out barely above a whisper. She lowered her head and stepped backward, carrying the weight of 200 staring eyes pressing against her like stones. Lord Cornelius Ashgrove did not look at her once. He simply adjusted his cufflink and muttered loud enough for the nearest table to hear, "One cannot polish the breeding out of a servant, no matter how many years they serve." More laughter followed. Seren felt her fingers trembling against the serving tray she retrieved from the sideboard. The humiliation should have ended there. On any other evening she would have disappeared back into the corridor where she belonged. But tonight something cracked open inside her. Perhaps it was the 7 years of silence pressing too hard against her ribs. Perhaps it was her mother's voice drifting through memory, like perfume through an open window. Whatever broke inside Seren Caldwell at that moment refused to be mended quietly. She set down the tray, she walked back toward the piano, and she sat down. Brienne's mouth fell open in shock. Cressida half rose from her chair. Lady Lenora whispered something furious that nobody heard, because by then, Seren's fingers had already found the keys. The first notes rose through the ballroom like something holy. Conversations collapsed mid-sentence. Wine glasses lowered slowly to tables. The orchestra musicians near the staircase turned toward the sound with visible astonishment, because the music pouring from that instrument carried more feeling than anything performed all evening. Seren played with her eyes closed, as though she had forgotten the 200 people staring at her, as though she had forgotten the 7 years of emptiness, as though she had returned to the only place she ever truly belonged. And from the far side of the ballroom, a tall figure in a dark coat slowly set down his glass of whiskey. His Grace, Duke Tavian Blackmere, had attended this celebration, expecting nothing but tedious conversation and political courtesy. He had ignored every introduction, every ambitious smile, and every calculated attempt to capture his attention throughout the entire evening. But now he was walking directly toward the piano, and toward the woman the whole room had been laughing at only moments before. But before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories filled with heartbreak, hidden strength, and powerful moments of justice, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use the super thanks button below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now let us continue. The mornings at Ashgrove Park began in darkness. Seren Caldwell rose at 4:30 each day, long before sunlight touched the frost-covered windows of the servants' quarters on the 3rd floor. The narrow room she shared with 2 other maids held nothing personal except a folded handkerchief embroidered with a small treble clef, the only possession left from her mother's life. She dressed quickly in the dim cold lacing her plain gray uniform by feel, and ascended the back staircase before any member of the Ashgrove family stirred beneath their silk bedsheets. Quote, "The kitchen was already alive by the time she arrived. Mrs. Garrett, the cook, moved between steaming iron pots, while the smell of fresh bread, simmering porridge, and black tea filled the warm stone room. Kitchen maids chopped vegetables with practiced speed, while footmen polished silver trays that would carry breakfast to the family dining room upstairs. Ashgrove Park ran on invisible labor, an enormous clockwork mechanism of scrubbing, polishing, carrying, and mending that never stopped turning from dawn until well past midnight. Saren's position inside this mechanism sat awkwardly between worlds. She had arrived 7 years earlier as a lady's maid to Lady Lenora Ashgrove, placed through a distant family connection after her father's death left her with nothing. A lady's maid typically commanded quiet respect among household staff. But Lady Lenora had gradually expanded Saren's responsibilities year after year until her original role became unrecognizable. She now supervised flower arrangements, managed guest room preparations, organized linen inventories, settled arguments between overtired kitchen workers, and performed whatever additional tasks the family considered beneath their own attention. Nobody questioned the arrangement. Saren worked without complaint, and the Ashgrove household had long since stopped noticing how much depended on her silence. The estate itself stood as one of the finest properties in the southern counties. Marble entrance halls stretched beneath vaulted ceilings painted with pastoral scenes of shepherdesses and rolling green hills. Crystal chandeliers hung above polished oak floors where generations of Ashgrove boots had walked with inherited confidence. Drawing rooms overflowed with French furniture upholstered in cream and gold, while floor-length windows framed manicured gardens descending toward a lake surrounded by ancient willow trees. Every surface inside Ashgrove Park whispered wealth, and every corridor reminded Saren of the distance between the world she once inhabited and the one she now occupied. Because Saren Caldwell had not always been a servant. Her father, the late Reverend Edmund Caldwell, had been a respected clergyman and classical scholar whose modest parish near the Dorset coast attracted visitors, drawn by his passionate lectures on philosophy, history, and music. Their home, though small, overflowed with leather-bound books, handwritten compositions, and evenings filled with conversation that stretched past midnight. Saren's mother, Isabel, had been a gifted pianist whose playing once moved guests to tears during a summer recital hosted by the Bishop of Salisbury. People who attended that evening spoke about it for years afterwards. The tatted Saren inherited her mother's gift entirely. By 14, she could play Beethoven sonatas from memory. By 18, visiting musicians told Reverend Caldwell that his daughter possessed rare and remarkable talent that deserved formal training. The piano had been the center of everything beautiful in Saren's early life, the instrument through which her mother's love still reached her long after Isabel died from fever when Saren was only 15, but none of that mattered anymore. Reverend Caldwell died suddenly when Saren was 22, leaving debts far larger than anyone expected. The parish house was claimed by creditors within weeks. The piano, her mother's beloved Broadwood, was sold at auction for a price that barely covered the burial costs. Friends who had praised Saren's intelligence and admired her playing during her father's lifetime suddenly became difficult to reach. Invitations stopped arriving. Letters went unanswered. Within 6 months, Saren stood at the servants' entrance of Ashgrove Park, carrying a single leather trunk, wearing a borrowed gray dress, and holding the embroidered handkerchief that was all that remained of Isabel Caldwell's existence. 7 years had passed since that afternoon. Saren was now 29 years old, and nobody inside the estate remembered she had ever been anything other than what she appeared, except in small moments that escaped her control. She used words the other servants did not use. She read books borrowed quietly from the estate library whenever the family traveled to London. Once, young Philip, the kitchen boy, sliced his thumb badly while peeling potatoes, and Saren bandaged the wound carefully, while reciting a story about a brave knight and a golden sword so vividly that the child forgot his pain entirely and begged her to tell another. Mrs. Garrett watched the scene from across the kitchen with quiet admiration and said nothing afterward. The hardest moments came whenever Saren passed the music room. The grand piano inside that room was a magnificent Broadwood concert instrument, polished weekly by servants who never played a single note upon it. Cressida occasionally practiced scales there, with mechanical disinterest, while her tutor corrected her posture. Briony plunked out simple melodies whenever she wanted attention, abandoning the instrument the moment compliments arrived. Anthea never touched it at all. Each time Saren walked past that open doorway carrying folded linens or silver tea trays, the sight of that piano struck something painful inside her chest. She could hear the notes it was capable of producing, simply by looking at its keys. She could feel her fingers remembering shapes and movements they had not performed in 7 years. Sometimes she stood in the corridor for several dangerous seconds too long, staring through the doorway, before forcing herself to continue walking. Mrs. Holloway, the head housekeeper, was the only person inside Ashgrove Park who treated Saren with consistent warmth. The older woman had served the estate for nearly 30 years, and possessed the rare ability to see people clearly, without judging them for what circumstances had forced them to become. "You carry yourself differently from the others, Mrs." Holloway told her once while they folded tablecloths together inside the linen room late one evening. "I have watched you for years, and I still cannot decide whether that difference is a blessing or a punishment." Saren smiled gently, but offered no answer. Late one Tuesday evening, while returning crystal dessert glasses to the cabinet near Lord Cornelius's private study, Saren heard voices through the partially open door. "The Vane family expects perfection at every gathering," Lord Cornelius was saying firmly. "Cressida's engagement celebration must surpass anything this county has witnessed in a decade." "And the household arrangements?" Lady Lenora asked. "The Caldwell woman handles everything competently enough. That is presumably why we keep her." A longer silence followed, before Lady Lenora added quietly, "She does make certain guests uncomfortable occasionally. Something in the way she speaks feels above her station. People have begun to notice, then remind her of her station more firmly. A servant who forgets her place is worse than a servant who never had one." Saren stood motionless in the darkened corridor. The crystal glasses trembled faintly against each other inside her hands. She waited until the conversation moved elsewhere, then walked away on legs that barely held her upright. That night, lying awake inside her narrow bed while the other maids slept, Saren pressed her mother's handkerchief against her chest and stared into the darkness above her. Somewhere far below, behind a closed and silent door, a piano sat waiting in an empty room. And somewhere inside Saren, a voice that sounded exactly like her mother whispered the same words it had whispered every night for 7 years. "You were not made for silence." The weeks leading up to Cressida Ashgrove's engagement to Lord Percival Vane transformed the entire estate into a monument of calculated extravagance. Carriages arrived daily from London, carrying crates of imported champagne, bolts of ivory silk, enormous glass vases etched with gold leaf, and fresh flowers shipped from southern France at extraordinary expense. The ballroom floor was stripped, sanded, and polished twice, until it shone like frozen water beneath the chandeliers. Musicians were summoned from Bath. A portrait painter arrived to capture the engaged couple during dinner. Servants worked 14-hour days, while the scent of vanilla sponge, roasted lamb, buttered pastries, and cinnamon-spiced wine drifted endlessly through every corridor. Lady Lenora placed nearly all responsibility for the preparations directly onto Saren. "You understand these matters better than the other staff," she explained, over breakfast one morning, her tone suggesting a compliment that carried no actual warmth. "In short, nothing falls below the standard Lord Vane's family expects. Their opinion of this household depends entirely on these details." Saren nodded quietly. "Yes, my lady." For 18 consecutive days, she supervised every element of the celebration personally. She inspected guest rooms for imperfections. Invisible to anyone else, she corrected flower arrangements 3 times after Briony changed her color preferences overnight. She resolved a near disaster involving mismatched table linens, discovered only 2 days before the event. She managed exhausted kitchen staff who had been baking since before dawn, settled a dispute between 2 footmen over serving positions, and personally ironed 140 napkins folded into the shape of swans after the first attempt failed to meet Lady Lenora's approval. Her hands ached constantly. She slept fewer than 4 hours most nights, and not once did a single member of the Ashgrove family acknowledge her effort. Cressida swept through the preparations, like visiting royalty, inspecting a foreign country. Her engagement gown, a layered creation of pearl-white satin and French lace that reportedly cost more than Saren's father had earned in 5 years of ministry, arrived in a velvet-lined trunk carried by 4 men. Diamond earrings borrowed from Lady Lenora's private collection were fitted against Cressida's neck, while 3 maids adjusted every fold and ribbon surrounding her. "The lilies near the west entrance look wilted," Cressida remarked carelessly while passing Saren in the corridor 2 days before the celebration. "If you cannot manage flowers properly, I shall speak to Mother about finding someone who can." The lilies were not wilted. Saren replaced them anyway. On the evening of the celebration, Ashgrove Park blazed with light visible from half a mile down the country road. Hundreds of candles illuminated the ballroom while guests arrived, wearing their finest evening clothes. Noble women in embroidered silk glided between tables carrying crystal champagne glasses, while gentlemen discussed horses, property, and parliamentary gossip beside the marble fireplaces. Platters of glazed duck, honeyed carrots, smoked salmon arranged on beds of crushed ice, roasted potatoes glistening with butter, and towering desserts layered with cream and sugared berries covered the dining tables beneath golden candlelight. Saren moved carefully between guests, carrying trays, refilling glasses, and clearing plates with the trained invisibility expected of excellent household staff. For the first hour, nobody acknowledged her existence beyond pointing at empty glasses. Then the Countess of Belfort approached her near the champagne table. "My dear, you speak with such lovely diction," the elderly woman said kindly after Saren directed her toward the powder room. "Tell me, where were you educated?" Before Saren could answer carefully, Brienne appeared beside them, carrying a half-empty wineglass and a look of pure delight. "Educated?" She laughed brightly. "The maid? Countess, you are far too generous." "Saren arranges our flowers and folds our napkins. That is the extent of her education." Several nearby guests turned toward the exchange with uncomfortable curiosity. The Countess looked momentarily confused, then embarrassed after realizing her mistake. "Forgive me," the older woman murmured before moving away quickly. Brienne watched Saren's face with open satisfaction. "Honestly, you must stop confusing people. When you speak above yourself, it embarrasses everyone." Saren lowered her eyes. "Yes, Miss Brienne." The humiliation deepened during dinner. Lord Percival Vane raised his glass proudly beside Cressida, while guests offered toasts to their future happiness. Cressida glowed beneath the attention, her diamond earrings catching the candlelight with every movement. Anthea smiled politely beside her own suitor, a quiet young baron whose name Saren had not been told because servants were not included in introductions. Then, Lady Lenora instructed Saren to serve the dessert course personally because 2 kitchen maids had collapsed from exhaustion in the back corridor. As Saren placed lemon cakes carefully before the head table, Cressida tilted her head with theatrical sympathy. "How thoughtful of you, Saren. You do serve beautifully. Perhaps that is your truest talent." Brienne laughed immediately. Better than her talent for staring at pianos, she is not allowed to play. The laughter spread wider this time. Even Anthea smiled behind her napkin. Lord Cornelius said nothing which carried its own particular cruelty, because his silence confirmed agreement. But the worst moment came near the end of the evening. A string quartet had been performing waltzes throughout the celebration. During a brief pause between pieces, the lead violinist stepped away to tune his instrument, leaving the ballroom momentarily without music. The grand piano sat open and gleaming beside the orchestra chairs, its keys catching light from the chandelier above. Saren had been collecting empty glasses near the musicians' area when her eyes drifted involuntarily toward the instrument. For 3 seconds her gaze rested upon the keys, with a longing so deep and visible that it silenced the nearest table completely. Brienne noticed instantly. "Oh, look," she announced with exaggerated wonder to the guests surrounding her. "The maid is staring at the piano again. Shall we let her perform next? Perhaps she can play us a servant's jig." Laughter erupted across the ballroom. Lord Cornelius closed his eyes briefly with visible irritation. Lady Lenora turned towards Saren with a coldness sharper than the December wind outside. "Enough. Remove yourself from the ballroom immediately." The command was quiet but absolute. Several guests pretended to study their wine glasses while Saren set down her tray, curtsied mechanically, and walked toward the service corridor. She kept her back straight and her face composed until she passed through the doorway into the narrow stone passage behind the kitchen. Then her body folded. She pressed her back against a cold wall and slid downward until she sat on the floor with her knees pulled against her chest. Her breathing came in broken, uneven waves, while tears ran silently down her cheeks. She covered her mouth with both hands to keep any sound from reaching the ballroom. Because even her grief was not permitted to disturb the celebration, she had spent 18 days building for people who despised her. Footsteps approached softly. Mrs. Holloway appeared, carrying a warm cloth and a cup of tea sweetened with honey. The older woman said nothing at first. She simply sat down on the cold stone floor beside Saren, placed the tea gently into her trembling hands, and waited. "I am being foolish," Saren whispered after several minutes. "No," Mrs. Holloway replied quietly. "You are being broken by people who do not deserve the strength it cost you to stand beside them every day." Saren's composure nearly shattered completely at those words. She pressed the warm cup against her lips and breathed slowly until the shaking stopped. "Your mother would be proud of you," Mrs. Holloway added softly. "Not because you endure this, because you remain gentle despite it." Saren could not answer. She simply nodded while fresh tears fell silently into the tea. Hours later, long past midnight, the final carriages departed down the gravel drive. Servants swept the ballroom floors while kitchen staff scrubbed pots in exhausted silence. The Ashgrove family retired upstairs without a single word of gratitude to anyone who had made the evening possible. Saren completed her final duties mechanically. She locked the silver cabinet. She checked the kitchen fires. She folded the last tablecloth and placed it inside the linen cupboard, with hands that no longer trembled because there was nothing left inside her to shake. Then, walking through the darkened ground floor corridor toward the back staircase, she stopped. The music room door was open. Moonlight fell through the tall windows and landed directly across the piano keys, turning the ivory pale blue and the ebony into deep silver. The room was completely empty. The house was completely silent. And for the first time in 7 years, nobody stood between Saren Caldwell and the instrument that had once been the center of her entire world. She stepped inside. She sat down on the velvet bench. She placed her trembling fingers against the cold keys, and in the darkness of Ashgrove Park, after 7 years of enforced silence, Saren Caldwell began to play. The music that poured from Saren's fingers inside the darkened music room carried 7 years of silence within every note. She played without thinking. Her hands remembered what her conscious mind had tried to bury, moving across the keys with a fluency that should have been impossible after so many years without practice. Yet the music came as naturally as breathing, as though her body had been rehearsing in secret every night while she slept, keeping the gift alive beneath the surface where nobody could take it away. The first piece she played was her mother's favorite, a nocturne by Chopin that Isabel Caldwell had performed so often in their small parlor near the Dorset coast that the melody had become inseparable from the memory of her face. Saren had learned it at 12 years old, sitting beside her mother on the piano bench, while autumn rain tapped against the windows and her father read quietly beside the fire. Isabel's fingers had been longer than Saren's, more elegant, and they moved across the keys with a gentleness that made even simple passages sound like prayers. Music is how the heart speaks when words are too small. Isabel had told her once while correcting the placement of her thumb against a difficult chord. Saren had been too young to understand those words then. She understood them now. After Isabel died from fever when Saren was 15, the piano became the only place where her mother's presence still felt real. Saren played for hours every evening while her father listened from his reading chair, often closing his book entirely to watch her with a gaze that held both pride and quiet heartbreak. The Reverend never remarried. He poured his remaining love into Saren's education. her music, and the belief that her talent would carry her toward a future worthy of Isabel's memory. Then Emmerich Wynne arrived at the parish during the spring. Siren turned 20. He was a young violin teacher who had been recommended to the Reverend by a mutual friend at Oxford. Emmerich came from modest means himself, the son of a village schoolmaster in Wiltshire, but he carried a warmth and intellectual curiosity that immediately endeared him to the Caldwell household. He spoke about music the way other men spoke about commerce, with passion, precision, and complete sincerity. Their first conversation lasted past midnight inside the parlor while her father dozed contentedly in his chair. Within weeks, their afternoon rehearsals became the fixed point around which Siren's entire world revolved. Emmerich played violin while Siren accompanied him on piano, and together they produced something neither could create alone. He admired not only her technique, but the emotion she wove through every phrase, the way she made listeners feel the music rather than simply hear it. By autumn, they were deeply in love. The Reverend approved without reservation, recognizing in Emmerich the same quiet decency that Isabel had once recognized in him. Plans began forming for a modest wedding the following spring. Emmerich spoke about opening a small music school together. Siren imagined a life built not on wealth or status, but on the two things she valued most in the world: love and music. Then Reverend Caldwell collapsed during a Sunday sermon and died 3 days later. The debts that surfaced afterwards shocked everyone. Unpaid loans against the parish house, overdue accounts with London booksellers, medical bills from Isabel's illness that had never been fully settled. Within weeks, creditors arrived and stripped the home bare. Furniture was carted away. Books were sold in bundles, and the piano, Isabel's beautiful Broadwood, was loaded onto a cart by two men who did not understand what they were carrying, and driven away down a muddy lane while Siren watched from the empty parlor window. Emmerich begged her to let him help. He offered to sell everything he owned. He proposed marriage immediately, insisting they could survive on his teaching income alone and rebuild slowly together. But Siren looked at the life stretching ahead of them and saw only the kind of grinding poverty that would eventually crush the very gentleness she loved most about him. She could not bear to become his burden. She refused to watch music become something they resented because it could not feed them. So she refused him. The morning she told Emmerich her decision was the second worst morning of her life, surpassed only by the morning she buried her father. Emmerich stood in the empty parlor doorway with his violin case in one hand and his hat in the other, and the look on his face was something Siren carried inside her chest every single day, afterward, like a stone she could never set down. "You are making a mistake," he said quietly. "I am making a sacrifice," she answered. "There is a difference." He left that afternoon. Siren entered service at Ashgrove Park 3 months later. Years afterward, Mrs. Afterward Holloway mentioned casually that a young violin teacher in Wiltshire had recently married the daughter of a local physician. The housekeeper had no idea the information carried any significance. Siren smiled politely, excused herself, and spent the next hour sitting alone inside the linen cupboard, with her hand pressed against her mouth, breathing very carefully until the pain became manageable again. Emmerich was alive. He was married, and the life Siren had refused in order to protect him had simply been built with someone else instead. That was the wound beneath all the other wounds. Not that she had lost love, but that she had chosen to destroy it herself. Inside the darkened music room of Ashgrove Park, Siren finished the nocturne and let her hands rest silently against the keys. Tears had fallen onto the ivory without her noticing. The room held the fading notes the way a church holds the echo of a hymn after the congregation has departed. Then, a floorboard creaked behind her. Siren's entire body went rigid with terror. She turned slowly and found Mrs. Holloway standing in the doorway, wrapped in a woolen shawl, her face lit faintly by moonlight through the corridor windows. The older woman's cheeks were wet. "How long have you been able to do that?" Mrs. Holloway whispered. Siren's voice barely functioned. "My whole life." A long silence passed between them. Siren waited for the reprimand, the warning, the reminder that servants did not touch instruments belonging to the household. Instead, Mrs. Holloway wiped her eyes with the corner of her shawl and spoke very quietly. "The door will be unlocked again tomorrow night." Then she turned and disappeared into the dark corridor without another word. Saren remained seated at the piano for a long time afterward, her trembling hands still resting where her mother had once taught her to place them, wondering whether the kindness of one person could be enough to survive the cruelty of an entire household. It could not, of course, but it helped. Anthea Ashgrove's engagement to Lord Rufus Ashby arrived with considerably less fanfare than Cressida's celebration, but carried its own particular cruelty for Saren. Lord Rufus was a politically ambitious young baron who spoke almost exclusively about parliamentary reform and treated his future bride with the same polite detachment he might offer a business associate. During the announcement dinner, Anthea glowed beside him with rehearsed happiness, while he discussed grain tariffs with Lord Cornelius for the better part of an hour. Twice during the evening, Anthea placed her hand gently on his arm, and twice he shifted away without acknowledging the gesture. Saren noticed. Nobody else appeared to care. The preparations followed the familiar pattern. Lady Lenora issued instructions. Saren executed every one of them. Guest rooms were cleaned, menus were approved, musicians were booked, and hundreds of candles were purchased from the chandler in town. Saren worked from before dawn until after midnight for 12 consecutive days, while the Ashgrove daughters discussed gown fabrics and seating preferences with the seriousness of generals planning a campaign. But beneath the celebration, something had shifted inside the household. Cressida had returned from her married home for the occasion, and the pride she once carried had developed visible cracks. Lord Percival Vane, her husband, had not accompanied her. When asked about his absence, Cressida offered clipped explanations involving business travel that changed slightly each time she repeated them. Servants who had attended the Vane household whispered that Lord Percival spent most evenings away from the estate entirely, returning well past midnight smelling of tobacco and perfume that did not belong to his wife. Cressida's bitterness sharpened in direct proportion to her private unhappiness. During the celebration dinner, while guests enjoyed poached salmon with dill sauce, roasted vegetables glazed in honey, warm bread rolls, and chilled white wine from the Ashgrove cellar, she watched Saren refill water glasses with a hostility she no longer bothered to conceal. "You would think a servant of her years would have found a husband by now," Cressida remarked to Anthea loudly enough for 3 tables to overhear. "Even kitchen maids manage that eventually." Briony leaned forward with sparkling cruelty. "Perhaps Saren is waiting for a prince. She does seem to believe she belongs above her station." Anthea smiled with practiced delicacy. "Be kind. Not everyone is fortunate enough to attract suitable attention." The word suitable landed precisely where it was intended. Saren continued pouring water without expression, though her grip tightened against the pitcher until her knuckles whitened. Later that evening, a retired colonel, visiting from Hampshire, engaged Saren briefly in conversation while she adjusted his chair cushion. He commented on the quality of the floral arrangements, and Saren responded with a knowledgeable remark about the seasonal availability of certain French roses. The colonel raised his eyebrows with pleasant surprise. "Remarkable," he said warmly. "You speak as though you have studied horticulture properly." Before Saren could deflect the compliment, Lady Lenora appeared beside them like a shadow given human form. "Saren has many useful household skills," she interrupted smoothly, while guiding the colonel's attention elsewhere. Then she turned back with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Please refrain from engaging guests in personal conversation. It creates confusion about your position." Saren curtsied silently. "Yes, my lady." But the worst moment came late that night, long after the final guests had departed. Saren was carrying the last stack of laundered tablecloth through the upper corridor when Lord Cornelius's voice carried through the study door with unusual clarity. 2 daughters successfully matched now. "The household reputation is stronger than ever." "Indeed," Lady Lenora replied, "though we must discuss the Caldwell matter. Lady Ashby's mother mentioned privately that she found it peculiar we employ a servant who speaks like a gentlewoman. She asked whether the girl had some connection to the family. A brief silence followed. That is precisely the problem. She draws attention that reflects poorly upon us. Then perhaps it is time to consider a transfer. My cousin Theodora requires domestic help at her property in Northumbria. The house is isolated, no society, no gatherings, no uncomfortable questions. Arrange it after the season concludes. Saren stood frozen in the corridor, her arms full of tablecloths pressing against her chest. Northumbria, an isolated estate where nobody gathered, nobody entertained, and nobody would ever hear her play again, even in secret. They were not simply ignoring her anymore. They were preparing to erase her completely. She walked away slowly before anyone noticed her listening, and that night she played the piano longer than any night before, pressing the music out of herself as though trying to leave something permanent inside the walls of a house that was already planning to forget she had ever existed. Briony Ashgrove's engagement to Sir Gavin Trelawney exploded across the county like a firework display that refused to end. Sir Gavin was the youngest son of a Cornish mining magnate, whose family had purchased their title only one generation earlier, with wealth pulled directly from tin deposits beneath the western cliffs. He possessed thick sideburns, a booming laugh, and the confident swagger of a man who believed money could purchase anything, including the respect of families who had held their titles for centuries. Lord Cornelius privately considered Sir Gavin vulgar, but the Trelawney fortune was too enormous to refuse, and Briony had always cared more about the size of diamonds than the age of bloodlines. The engagement celebration was designed to be the largest social event Ashgrove Park had ever hosted. Invitations were dispatched to families across 4 counties. A temporary pavilion was constructed beside the gardens to accommodate the overflow of guests. French champagne arrived by the cartload. An ice sculptor was commissioned from London to create a swan centerpiece for the dining table. The kitchen staff doubled with hired workers from the village, and the entire ground floor of the estate was polished, rearranged, and decorated until it resembled a palace more than a country manor. Saren managed everything. She had not been asked, she had simply been expected to ensure perfection without formal instruction, acknowledgement, or gratitude. For 3 straight weeks, she supervised construction workers, organized catering logistics, resolved daily crises involving late deliveries and broken glassware, and coordinated the movements of 60 additional staff members who had never worked inside the estate before. She slept fewer than 3 hours most nights. Her hands developed painful cracks from constant washing and handling of cleaning solutions, and the only person who noticed her deteriorating condition was Mrs. Matterborough Holloway, who quietly left salve and clean bandages beside her bed each morning, without comment. Briony treated the preparations as a personal stage production in which she played the only role that mattered. She changed her gown selection 4 times during the final week, requiring Saren to rearrange the dressing room each time. She rejected 3 separate table arrangements because the flowers clashed with her complexion. She complained about the temperature of her tea, the starch in her pillows, the angle of the mirrors in the ballroom, and the speed at which servants responded when she rang her bell. "You would think," Briony announced one afternoon while Saren adjusted centerpieces for the 4th consecutive time, "that after all these years of watching my sisters marry, you would have learned how celebrations work without needing constant correction." Saren said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was cheaper than dignity inside this household. On the evening of the celebration, Ashgrove Park blazed with more light than the estate had ever produced. Every window glowed amber and gold. Carriages lined the gravel drive for nearly a quarter mile, while guests streamed through the entrance hall wearing their most elaborate evening attire. The ballroom overflowed with the scent of roasted pheasant, honey-glazed pork, buttered asparagus, warm apple tarts dusted with cinnamon, sugar and champagne fizzing inside crystal flutes that reflected the chandelier light in tiny scattered stars across the ceiling. Briony entered the ballroom in a gown of deep rose silk, trimmed with seed pearls that reportedly cost more than Saren would earn in 15 years of service. Sir Gavin stood beside her, looking enormously pleased with himself, while guests raised glasses and offered congratulations that ranged from genuine warmth to carefully disguised envy. Cressida had returned again. thinner now with shadows beneath her eyes that powder could not entirely conceal. Lord Percival was once again absent. Anthea stood beside Lord Rufus, who spent most of the evening discussing canal investments with other gentlemen while his wife smiled into empty space. Both married sisters watched Briony's triumphant celebration with faces that flickered between pride and something much less comfortable. Then Briony raised her champagne glass. 3 Ashgrove daughters, she announced brightly, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. 3 successful marriages. Mother and father must be enormously proud. She paused, deliberately allowing her eyes to sweep the room before landing precisely on Saren, who stood near the far wall, holding a silver tray of champagne glasses. Of course, not everyone inside this household can claim such accomplishments. But then, some people were never meant for the drawing room. They were made for the corridor behind it. The laughter that followed was the loudest and cruelest Saren had ever endured inside Ashgrove Park. Even guests who did not know her looked toward her with amused pity. Sir Gavin laughed, the hardest of all, slapping his thigh as though Briony had delivered the cleverest line in theatrical history. Saren remained perfectly still. She did not lower her eyes. She did not leave. She stood holding the silver tray while the laughter washed over her. Like ice water, and something behind her face changed so subtly that only Mrs. Holloway, watching from the service doorway, recognized it. It was not pain. It was not even anger. It was the quiet resignation of someone who had finally accepted that nothing she could ever do would earn the respect of people who had decided her worth before she ever entered the room. Later that night, alone in the servants' corridor, Saren overheard the final conversation that nearly broke her entirely. Lord Cornelius was speaking with Lady Lenora inside the drawing room while servants cleared the ballroom behind them. Theodora has confirmed the arrangement. The Northumbria property requires a housekeeper beginning next month. Good. Inform the Caldwell woman after the season. There is no reason to create disruption before then. She will not resist. She has nowhere else to go. Precisely. Saren pressed her back against the corridor wall and closed her eyes. The stone felt cold through the thin fabric of her uniform. Northumbria, 1 month. The secret midnight hours at the piano, the only moments in 7 years that had kept her heart breathing, would end permanently. She returned to her room and sat on the edge of her narrow bed for a very long time, holding her mother's handkerchief against her face, while the house settled into silence around her. Then Mrs. Holloway knocked softly and entered without waiting. I overheard as well, the older woman said quietly, sitting beside her on the bed. And before you accept it, I want you to know something. Saren looked at her with exhausted eyes. Lord Cornelius received an unexpected acceptance this evening. Someone he never believed would attend has confirmed their presence at the midsummer gathering next month. Who? Mrs. Connor. Holloway paused before answering, as though the name itself carried weight she wanted Saren to feel. His Grace, Duke Tavian Blackmere. The name meant nothing to Saren. But the look on Mrs. Baxpier. Holloway's face suggested that before Northumbria claimed her, something inside Ashgrove Park was about to change in a way nobody expected. Across England, the name Blackmere carried the kind of weight that made powerful men measure their words carefully before speaking. The Blackmere estate, Aldenmore, stood on the northern coast overlooking a stretch of wild moorland that descended sharply toward Black Sea cliffs where Atlantic storms had carved deep ravines into the rock over centuries. The house itself was enormous and severe, built from dark Yorkshire stone with towering chimneys, arched windows and ivy-covered walls that made it resemble something between a cathedral and a fortress. Inside, vast corridors lined with ancestral portraits led to rooms furnished in deep burgundy leather, aged mahogany, and oil paintings depicting generations of Blackmere men who had all shared the same intense, watchful gaze. Duke Tavian Blackmere had inherited the title at 24 after his father's death from a riding accident. Within a decade, he had expanded the family's already considerable fortune through shipping investments, coal interests, and strategic purchases of industrial land that made him one of the wealthiest men in the country before his 35th birthday. Politicians sought his endorsement during elections. Bankers presented investment proposals with visible anxiety. Noble families across 3 counties treated invitations to Aldenmore the way lesser clergy treated invitations to the Vatican. Yet, for all his influence, Tavian Blackmere was spoken about most often, not for his wealth or his power, but for the coldness that surrounded him like winter air trapped inside a stone chapel. At 38, the Duke had attended fewer than a handful of social events in the past 5 years. He lived largely alone inside Aldenmore, accompanied only by a small household staff, who had learned through experience that silence was safer than conversation in his presence. He worked late into every evening, surrounded by correspondence, shipping ledgers, and parliamentary documents, eating meals alone at a desk rather than the dining table built to seat 30 guests. His study overlooked the sea cliffs, and on stormy nights the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below provided the only company he seemed to welcome. All of London society knew the name Lady Lysara Fontaine. Lysara had entered Tavian's life during a summer season in London 5 years earlier, introduced through mutual acquaintances at a charity concert hosted by the Duchess of Pemberton. She possessed dark auburn hair, remarkable green eyes, and a voice calibrated precisely to make every man who heard it believe he was the only person she had ever truly spoken to. Her beauty was undeniable, but more dangerous than her appearance was her intelligence. Lysara understood social architecture with the precision of an engineer, knowing exactly which words, glances, and gestures could make a man believe he had discovered something rare, when in truth he was being carefully constructed into a stepping stone. Tavian fell completely. For the first time since inheriting the dukedom, he allowed someone past the careful barriers he had built around himself. He opened Aldenmore to her. He introduced her to his mother, the Dowager Duchess Helene. He financed the restoration of her family's crumbling estate in Hampshire, settling debts that would have otherwise destroyed the Fontaine name entirely. He spoke publicly about marriage at events where newspapers recorded every word. Lysara accepted everything with grace, warmth, and an affection that felt perfectly genuine to everyone who witnessed it. Then, 6 weeks before the engagement was to be formally announced, Tavian discovered the truth. A business associate mentioned casually during a private dinner that the Fontaine family had been negotiating a marriage arrangement with Lord Harland Carew for over a year. The arrangement predated Lysara's relationship with Tavian entirely. Every moment of affection, every private conversation, every quiet evening she had spent inside Aldenmore had been a calculated performance designed to extract maximum financial recovery for her family before she married the man she had actually chosen long before the Duke ever entered her life. Tavian confronted her. Inside the library of Aldenmore on a Tuesday evening, while rain hammered against the windows, Lysara did not deny anything. She did not apologize. She simply looked at him with a face stripped of every pretense she had worn for 18 months and spoke with brutal honesty. You offered rescue. Harland offers partnership. Surely you understand the difference. Those words burned through Tavian like acid poured across an open wound. The humiliation that followed was even worse than the betrayal itself. London society devoured the scandal within days. Noble women whispered behind opera glasses. Gentlemen exchanged knowing smiles at club dinners. The powerful Duke of Aldenmore, who commanded respect across industries and Parliament, had been deceived by a woman who had treated his devotion as nothing more than a financial instrument. Tavian withdrew from public life almost completely afterward. Women continued pursuing him relentlessly at the few events he attended, but every smile now looked like calculation, every compliment sounded like strategy, and every show of admiration triggered the same nauseating memory of discovering that the only person he had trusted in years, his mother, watched the transformation with deepening concern. Dowager Duchess Helene was a perceptive woman who had survived her own share of aristocratic cruelty and emerged with her compassion intact. She visited Aldenmore monthly, bringing home baked bread, fresh flowers, and conversation that Tavian tolerated more than welcomed. You are becoming your grandfather, she told him one evening while they sat beside the fire in the drawing room. He died alone in this house, with more money than friends, and more pride than warmth. I buried him and swore my own son would live differently. Tavian stared into the fire without answering. Not every heart is a performance, Tavian. Every heart I have encountered has been. Helene studied her son's face and saw the same guarded look he had worn since childhood, whenever pain became too large to process safely. She recognized it because his father had worn it identically. "Then you have been looking in the wrong rooms," she said quietly. Weeks later, a formal invitation arrived at Aldenmore from Lord Cornelius Ashgrove, requesting the Duke's attendance at a midsummer gathering celebrating the family's social achievements and new business alliances. Under ordinary circumstances, Tavian would have discarded it without a second glance. But Lord Cornelius had recently acquired significant interest in northern shipping routes that intersected directly with Blackmere commercial operations. Refusing entirely risked creating political friction that Tavian considered unnecessary. He stared at the invitation for a long time inside his study, while wind rattled the windows overlooking the cliffs. One evening he said, finally placing the card aside, "Nothing more." His valet prepared the carriage the following week. The journey south took the better part of a day through rolling countryside that gradually softened from moorland into manicured farmland. As evening fell, the lights of Ashgrove Park appeared through a thin curtain of summer rain, glowing amber and gold against the darkening sky. Tavian leaned back against the leather seat and closed his eyes. He expected nothing from the evening ahead, except polite conversation, political courtesy, and the familiar exhaustion of watching people perform for his attention. He had no idea that in fewer than 3 hours, a woman holding a serving tray inside that glittering ballroom would sit down at a piano, and the sound she made would reach something inside him that 5 years of silence had failed to kill. The moment Duke Tavian Blackmere entered the ballroom of Ashgrove Park, the atmosphere shifted as though someone had pulled the air from the room and replaced it with something thinner and more electric. Conversations faltered. Women straightened. Several mothers physically repositioned their daughters into his line of sight while whispering urgent instructions about posture, smiling, and the critical importance of appearing effortlessly charming. The ballroom blazed with candlelight reflecting off crystal glasses, polished marble floors, and jewels draped across every neck and wrist in the room. Long tables overflowed with roasted venison, herb-crusted lamb, glazed root vegetables, warm crusty bread, bowls of clotted cream, and strawberry tarts dusted with powdered sugar. Lord Cornelius nearly tripped over his own feet, hurrying forward to greet the Duke personally. Lady Lenora transformed from composed hostess into barely restrained excitement within seconds, adjusting her necklace and smoothing her gown as though royalty had arrived unexpectedly. Tavian endured the introductions with practiced patience. He shook hands. He nodded at appropriate intervals. He answered questions about shipping investments and parliamentary votes, with responses brief enough to be polite, but short enough to discourage further conversation. Bryony positioned herself directly in his path twice during the first hour, each time laughing at something Sir Gavin said with volume specifically calculated to attract the Duke's attention. Cressida attempted a conversation about French literature that lasted less than 2 minutes before Tavian excused himself. Anthea simply watched from a distance, measuring him the way one measures an expensive painting that might be available for purchase. A young countess tried to engage him in discussion about Italian opera. A baronet's daughter laughed so loudly at his polite remark about the weather that several guests turned in alarm. Even Lady Lenora herself lingered too long beside him, praising the estate's gardens with rehearsed enthusiasm until Tavian excused himself with barely disguised weariness. None of them reached him. They could not, because every word they spoke passed through the same invisible barrier that had surrounded Tavian for 5 years, the one that filtered every human interaction through the memory of discovering that warmth could be manufactured and affection could be twisted into strategy. The evening continued. Tavian found himself standing near the edge of the ballroom, holding a glass of whiskey he had barely touched, silently counting the minutes until departure became socially acceptable. He had fulfilled his obligation. The political courtesy had been extended. Nothing inside this room held any interest for him whatsoever. Then, A voice cut through the ballroom noise like something sharp striking glass. "Get your hands away from that instrument." Tavian turned toward the sound. Near the far end of the room, a young woman in a plain gray dress stood frozen beside the grand piano. Her fingertips rested against the polished lid with the lightest possible touch, and the look on her face was one Tavian recognized immediately, though he could not have explained why. It was longing, the kind that lives so deep inside someone it becomes visible only in unguarded moments. Brianne's mocking voice carried across the room. "Did you see that?" The maid thought she could touch the piano. Laughter followed. Tavian watched the woman's face burn with humiliation while 200 people stared at her. He watched Lady Lenora order her back to her duties. He heard Lord Cornelius deliver his remark about breeding and servants, and he watched the entire room laugh at a woman whose only crime had been reaching towards something beautiful. Then something happened that Tavian did not expect. The woman set down her serving tray. She walked back to the piano, and she sat down. The shock rippled outward like a stone dropped into perfectly still water. Brianne's mouth fell open. Cressida half rose from her chair. Lady Lenora whispered something furious, but by then the woman's fingers had found the keys. The first notes rose through the ballroom, and Tavian's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The music was extraordinary. Not merely skilled, not merely practiced, but alive in a way that separated genuine artistry from technical competence as clearly as sunlight separates morning from night. The melody moved through the room like something with physical weight, pressing against the walls, settling into the silence between heartbeats, and reaching into places inside the listeners that polite conversation had never touched. The woman played with her eyes closed. Her fingers moved across the keys with a certainty that contradicted everything about her appearance. Her plain dress, her servant's posture, her lowered status inside this household. The music pouring from that instrument did not belong to a maid. It belonged to someone who had been trained with devotion, who had spent years building a relationship with the piano that went far beyond performance into something approaching prayer. Tavian set his glass down without looking where he placed it. Around him, the ballroom had fallen completely silent. Orchestra musicians stared openly, guests exchanged bewildered glances, but Tavian was no longer observing the room. He was walking. He crossed the ballroom slowly, passing tables of stunned guests, passing Brianne's frozen face, passing Lord Cornelius's visible confusion, moving directly toward the woman at the piano, with the certainty of someone who had just heard the first honest sound in 5 years of silence. The music ended. The final notes hung in the air like smoke from extinguished candles. The woman opened her eyes and found 200 people staring at her. Then she looked up and saw the Duke standing directly beside the piano. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Tavian studied her face with an intensity that made nearby guests visibly uncomfortable. Her eyes were red from emotion. Her hands trembled slightly against the keys. She looked terrified and defiant and heartbroken all at once, and there was nothing performed about any of it. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Saren Caldwell, Your Grace." Her voice barely held together. "Who taught you to play like that?" "My mother." A pause. She must have been remarkable. She was. Tavian looked at the piano, then back at the woman sitting before it. "Would you play another piece?"
"For me?"
The request landed across the silent ballroom like a thunderclap. Brianne looked as though she had been physically struck. Lord Cornelius gripped the arm of his chair. Lady Lenora's face drained of all remaining color. Saren stared at the Duke for a long moment. Then she turned back toward the keys, placed her fingers gently against the ivory, and began to play her mother's nocturne. Tavian Blackmere stood beside the piano for the entire performance without moving. And by the time the final note faded into the chandelier light above them, something inside the wealthiest and most guarded man in England had shifted permanently. The evening ended shortly after midnight. Tavian departed with the same composed courtesy he had arrived with, shaking Lord Cornelius's hand and thanking Lady Lenora for the hospitality. But as his carriage pulled away down the gravel drive, he spoke to his footman without turning from the window. The woman who played the piano tonight find out everything about her, her family, her history. How she came to be a servant inside that house. The footman nodded silently. Tavian leaned back against the carriage seat and stared through the rain-streaked glass at the disappearing lights of Ashgrove Park. For the first time in 5 years, the silence inside his chest did not feel permanent. Within a fortnight of the midsummer gathering, Duke Tavian Blackmere began visiting Ashgrove Park with a frequency that sent tremors through the entire household. The first visit arrived without warning. His carriage appeared on the gravel drive on a Tuesday afternoon, and by the time Lord Cornelius reached the entrance hall, 2 footmen had already been dispatched to prepare the drawing room. The best tea service had been retrieved from the locked cabinet, and Mrs. Holloway had quietly instructed Saren to change from her working apron into the cleanest dress she owned. Tavian requested Saren's company within minutes of sitting down. Not her service, her company. He asked whether she might play something on the piano while he discussed business matters with Lord Cornelius, and the request was delivered so casually that refusing would have required Lord Cornelius to explain why his household maid should not be permitted to touch an instrument that had sat largely unused for years. Saren played Schubert that afternoon while Lord Cornelius pretended to concentrate on shipping contracts, and Lady Lenora sat rigidly in the corner with a smile that looked physically painful to maintain. The second visit came 4 days later. The third followed within the week. By the 4th visit, servants had begun preparing the Duke's preferred tea, strong black Darjeeling with no sugar, before his carriage reached the front gates. Each visit followed a similar pattern. Tavian would conduct whatever business justified his presence with Lord Cornelius, then spend the remaining hours in conversation with Saren. They spoke about music first, discussing composers, techniques, and the emotional architecture of certain pieces, with the kind of passionate specificity that only people who genuinely loved music could sustain. Then, conversations gradually widened. Books, philosophy. The difference between loneliness chosen and loneliness imposed. The particular weight of being surrounded by people who never truly see you. Saren spoke honestly with Tavian, in ways she had not spoken with anyone since her father's death. She told him about the Reverend's parish, about her mother's playing, about the auction where the piano was sold. She did not perform vulnerability or manufacture sympathy. She simply answered his questions with the same unguarded directness that had characterized her playing at the midsummer gathering. Tavian listened, with an attentiveness that unnerved her at first. He remembered details she had mentioned once, and referenced them naturally in later conversations. He brought her a bound collection of Chopin nocturnes during his 5th visit, placing it beside the piano without ceremony, as though gifting sheet music to a household maid were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Your mother's favorite was the Opus 9, number 2, he said simply. "I thought you might want the complete set." Saren held the leather-bound volume against her chest and could not speak for several seconds. Inside the household, the transformation was immediate and grotesque. Lord Cornelius began inviting Saren to sit near important guests during supper. He addressed her by her first name in warm tones he had never previously used. He introduced her to visiting businessmen as a valued member of the household, with particular musical talents, speaking about her as though he had personally nurtured her abilities for years. Lady Lenora's conversion was even more dramatic. Expensive fabric arrived from London within days. A seamstress was hired to create proper evening dresses for Saren in colors that complemented her complexion. Pearl earrings appeared on her bedside table, accompanied by a handwritten note from Lady Lenora, encouraging her to wear them during the Duke's visits. "You must present yourself well," Lady Lenora instructed one morning while adjusting a ribbon in Saren's hair, with motherly attention that had never existed before. The Duke notices refinement. The Northumbria transfer was never mentioned again. The isolated estate, the permanent erasure, the conversation about removing the servant who spoke above her station, vanished from discussion as though it had never occurred. Saren understood exactly what was happening. The family that had spent 7 years treating her as invisible furniture had suddenly discovered her usefulness the moment a wealthy and powerful man showed interest. Their affection was not a change of heart, it was a change of strategy. But the cruelty of their previous treatment made their current warmth feel almost worse, because it confirmed something Saren had always suspected. They had never been incapable of kindness. They had simply never considered her worth the effort. Mrs. Holloway watched the transformation with quiet skepticism. "New dresses do not erase old wounds," she told Saren one evening while they walked together through the garden. "Remember who was kind to you before the Duke arrived, and remember who was not." Saren nodded slowly. "I remember everything, Mrs. Chess." Holloway. The genuine moments between Saren and Tavian continued growing despite the manufactured atmosphere surrounding them. One afternoon, while walking beside the lake at the edge of the estate grounds, Tavian spoke about Aldenmore for the first time. He described the sea cliffs, the storms, the enormous silence of the moors stretching endlessly beneath gray skies. He spoke about his mother's visits and the bread she baked herself, despite having an entire kitchen staff. He did not mention Lysara directly, but Saren heard the shape of the wound in the spaces between his words. "You guard yourself very carefully," she said quietly, while watching ducks drift across the still water. "Experience teaches vigilance. Experience also teaches loneliness, if you allow it to become the only lesson." Tavian looked at her with something she had not seen before, a flicker between surprise and recognition, as though she had described a room inside his own house that he had forgotten existed. "You speak very directly for someone who has spent 7 years in silence," he said. "Perhaps 7 years of silence taught me not to waste words when I finally used them." A faint smile crossed his face. The first genuine smile Saren had ever witnessed from him. It vanished quickly, but its brief appearance changed something in the air between them that could not be changed back. That evening, after the Duke departed, Saren overheard Cressida speaking in a low, venomous whisper to Briony inside the drawing room. "This cannot continue. She is a servant. A servant. If he marries her, we become the family whose maid became a duchess. Society will never stop laughing." Briony's voice was colder than Saren had ever heard it. "Then, we ensure, it does not continue." Saren stepped away from the door before they heard her. Something sharp and familiar tightened inside her chest. The brief warmth of the afternoon beside the lake began cooling rapidly against the reality of the household she still inhabited. The sisters were planning something, and whatever it was, Saren knew, from 7 years of painful experience, that their cruelty had never once failed to reach its target. The conspiracy moved quickly. Within days of the whispered conversation, Cressida arranged a dinner gathering at Ashgrove Park and ensured that among the carefully selected guests, one name appeared that should not have been there: Lady Lysara Fontaine. Saren did not know the woman's history with Tavian. Nobody had told her, and the Duke himself had never spoken the name directly. But the moment Lysara entered the drawing room wearing midnight blue velvet with sapphires resting against her collarbone, Saren understood instinctively that this woman had not arrived by accident. Lysara moved through the gathering with effortless command, speaking warmly with guests, complimenting Lady Lenora's taste and decor, and positioning herself with calculated precision near every space the Duke occupied throughout the evening. She touched his arm while laughing at a shared memory. She referenced places they had visited together with intimate familiarity designed specifically to remind him of what they had once shared. Saren watched from across the room while serving guests, and something painful and unfamiliar twisted inside her chest. Not jealousy exactly, but the terrible recognition that she did not belong in the world these people inhabited. Lysara was beautiful, titled, wealthy, and confident. Saren was a maid in a borrowed dress, holding a tea tray. Then Lysara leaned closer to Tavian and murmured something that carried just far enough for Saren to hear. "She is charming in her way, Tavian, but surely you recognize the difference between novelty and companionship." Tavian's face did not change. He looked at Lysara with the same flat composure he had worn throughout the evening, but his voice carried an edge that silenced every nearby conversation. "The difference I recognize, Lady Fontaine, is between someone who performed affection to settle her family's debts and someone who played the piano with more honesty in 3 minutes than you demonstrated in 18 months. Lysara's composure cracked visibly. Her smile tightened. Her fingers whitened around her wine glass. Without another word, she turned away and did not approach him again for the remainder of the evening. But the sisters were not finished. Over the following weeks, rumors began circulating through society with suspicious coordination. Whispers spread through drawing rooms and church gatherings that Saren had deliberately manipulated the Duke's sympathies using false vulnerability. That she had engineered the piano performance of the midsummer gathering specifically to attract his attention, that she was a calculating fortune hunter disguised as an innocent servant. Saren heard the rumors through fragments carried by visiting guests and passing servants. Each accusation struck precisely because it inverted the truth so completely. She had not planned anything. She had not calculated anything. She had simply sat down at a piano on the worst night of her life and played because the silence had finally become more unbearable than the consequences. The cruelty worsened privately as well. Cressida cornered Saren inside the linen room one afternoon and spoke with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every word. You must understand how this appears. A penniless servant seducing the wealthiest duke in England through a piano performance. People are not as foolish as you hope. I seduced no one, Saren replied quietly. You performed helplessness so convincingly that even I was almost impressed. But he will grow tired. Men like Blackmere always do, and when he discards you, we will still be here, remember that. Anthea added her own pressure more subtly, mentioning casually during meals that the Duke had been seen at events in London where younger and more beautiful women had attended. Brienne simply watched Saren with open hostility during every gathering, waiting for a moment of visible weakness she could exploit. Saren endured it with the same quiet composure that had carried her through 7 years of service. But the weight was becoming unbearable. The combination of public rumors and private cruelty pressed against her from every direction, and she began wondering whether the brief joy had been worth the intensified pain that followed. Then everything changed on a Thursday evening. Tavian had returned to Ashgrove Park for what Lord Cornelius assumed was another routine visit. But as the Duke walked through the corridor toward the drawing room, raised voices stopped him near the partially open door. Brienne's voice came first, sharp and undisguised. She is ruining. Every newspaper in the county is discussing how the Ashgrove Maid bewitched the Duke. We are becoming a joke, Cressida replied bitterly. She should have been sent to Northumbria months ago. If Father had acted sooner, none of this embarrassment would have occurred. Anthea added with quiet venom. She has always believed herself above us. This entire performance is simply her revenge for years of imagined slights. Imagined? Brienne laughed coldly. She is a servant who forgot her place. Whatever happens with Blackmere, she must be removed from this household permanently. The damage is already done. Silence followed. Then the drawing room door opened fully, and Tavian Blackmere stood in the doorway. Every sister froze. Cressida's wineglass stopped mid-air. Brienne's face collapsed from righteous anger into undisguised fear. Anthea stared at the floor as though hoping it would open beneath her. Tavian's voice was perfectly controlled, but the force behind it filled the entire room. In the months I have visited this house, I have watched you humiliate a woman who supervised your celebrations, managed your household, and endured your contempt without once retaliating. I have listened to you mock her poverty as though wealth were a virtue and kindness were a weakness. And now, I discover you have been spreading deliberate lies through society to destroy the reputation of someone whose only offense was possessing talent and dignity that none of you could match. Nobody spoke. Lord Cornelius stood motionless near the fireplace. Lady Lenora's face had gone completely white. Saren Caldwell is the only person inside this household who has treated me with honesty since the first evening I arrived. She is the only person who has never once mentioned my title, my wealth, or my influence in any conversation we have shared, and she is the only person whose company I have sought willingly in 5 years. His eyes moved slowly across each sister's face before settling on Lord Cornelius. Whatever you have planned for her future, cancel it. Her future is no longer your decision. Then he turned and walked toward the garden where Saren sat, alone on a stone bench, reading the Chopin collection he had given her weeks earlier. She looked up as he approached and saw immediately that something had shifted in him. He sat beside her without speaking for several long seconds, while the evening air cooled around them. "What happened?" she asked softly. "I heard your family discussing you." Saren lowered her eyes. "I am sorry you were subjected to that. Do not apologize for cruelty you did not commit." Silence settled between them. Then Saren whispered something she had never said aloud to anyone before. "Nobody in my life has ever stood between me and the people who hurt me. Not once." Tavian looked at her for a long time. Then he reached into his coat pocket, and when he withdrew his hand, resting in his palm, was a small velvet box he had been carrying for longer than she could have known. "I intend to change that permanently," he said, "if you will allow me." Saren stared at the box. Her hands covered her mouth. She could not breathe properly. And inside the drawing room behind them, three sisters watched through the window as the world they had constructed around their own superiority began collapsing in absolute silence. 4 weeks later, the Grand Hall of Aldenmore blazed with more candlelight than the ancient estate had held in over a decade. Tavian had sent invitations across 3 counties for what society understood to be a formal reception, celebrating new Blackmere shipping alliances. The true purpose of the evening remained known only to 3 people: Tavian himself, Dowager Duchess Helene, and Saren, who had spent the previous month living quietly at Aldenmore as a personal guest of the Duchess while preparations unfolded around her. The estate had been transformed. Enormous arrangements of white roses and trailing ivy framed the entrance hall, while hundreds of beeswax candles lined the corridors leading toward the grand ballroom. A 40-piece orchestra occupied the western gallery, filling the vast space with waltzes that echoed off the vaulted stone ceilings. Long banquet tables held carved roasted beef, herb-crusted salmon, buttered new potatoes, braised leeks in cream sauce, warm bread rolls with salted butter, and an enormous tiered cake decorated with spun sugar and crystallized violets that had taken 3 pastry chefs 2 full days to complete. Guests arrived in waves throughout the evening. Nobility from across the northern and southern counties streamed through the entrance hall, visibly impressed by the scale and refinement of the gathering. Politicians shook hands beneath portraits of Blackmere ancestors. Wealthy industrialists discussed trade opportunities beside the enormous marble fireplaces. Women in silk and diamonds glided between conversations, each one secretly hoping the evening might signal the Duke's return to active social life and perhaps reveal whether the persistent rumors about a certain household maid carried any truth. Among the guests, the Ashgrove family arrived together. Lord Cornelius led the procession with practiced dignity, though his eyes moved nervously across the ballroom from the moment he entered. Lady Lenora walked beside him wearing her finest emerald gown, her face carefully arranged into pleasant composure. Behind him came Cressida, thinner and quieter than she had been a year earlier, with Lord Percival conspicuously absent once again. Anthea walked beside Lord Rufus, who was already scanning the room for political contacts. Briony entered last on Sir Gavin's arm, her features stiff with tension beneath a forced smile. None of them had seen Saren since the evening Tavian confronted them inside the drawing room. Lady Lysara Fontaine arrived late, wearing silver silk with her auburn hair pinned beneath a diamond circlet. She entered the ballroom with visible confidence, though several guests noticed her smile tighten slightly when she observed the scale of the celebration and recognized that this was not a routine business reception. The evening progressed with elegant predictability for the first 2 hours. Tavian moved among his guests with composed courtesy, answering questions and accepting congratulations on the new shipping ventures. He revealed nothing about the true purpose of the gathering. His manner remained pleasant but unreadable, and even those who had known him longest could not determine what lay beneath his careful composure. Then, at precisely 9 o'clock, the orchestra fell silent. Tavian walked to the center of the ballroom floor. The crowd parted around him instinctively while conversation died in widening circles outward from where he stood. Crystal glasses lowered, voices faded. Within 30 seconds, 300 guests stood watching the Duke in complete silence. Thank you all for joining me this evening, Tavian began. His voice carried easily across the vast space with the natural authority of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. I told you this gathering celebrated new alliances, and that is true, but not the kind you expected. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lady Lenora gripped Lord Cornelius's arm. Tavian turned toward the grand staircase at the far end of the ballroom. There is someone I would like you to meet. Siren appeared at the top of the staircase, and the ballroom inhaled collectively. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue silk that caught the candlelight like starlight reflected on dark water. Her dark hair was arranged simply with a single strand of pearls woven through it, a gift from Dowager Duchess Helen. She carried no fan, no jeweled accessories, no ornamental excess. She carried only herself, walking down the marble staircase with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that grace was not something that could be purchased or inherited, only earned through years of choosing gentleness when cruelty would have been easier. Whispers erupted immediately. Several guests recognized her from the midsummer gathering. Others had heard the rumors and were now seeing the subject of society's fascination for the first time. Lysara's wineglass lowered slowly to the table. Brienne went completely pale. Cressida reached for a chair to steady herself. Siren reached the bottom of the staircase and walked toward Tavian, with visible emotion trembling behind her composure. He met her halfway, taking her hand gently as the orchestra waited in silence. Then Tavian turned to face the assembled guests and spoke. For 5 years I avoided gatherings like this one, because I had come to believe that sincerity did not exist inside ballrooms, that every smile concealed a strategy, and every compliment disguised an ambition. His eyes moved briefly toward Lysara, who looked away. Then I walked into a room where a woman was being laughed at for touching a piano. A woman who had been a servant for 7 years. A woman whose family had been destroyed by debt and whose talent had been buried beneath silence and humiliation. And she sat down at that instrument and played with more honesty than I had heard from any human being in half a decade. The ballroom was absolutely still. Siren's eyes glistened, but she did not look away. In the weeks that followed, I discovered that Siren Caldwell was not merely talented. She was the kindest, most selfless, most genuinely honest person I had ever encountered. She treated servants with more respect than most nobility treats their equals. She endured cruelty from people who owed her gratitude, and she never once allowed bitterness to replace the gentleness that defined her. She never mentioned my title. She never referenced my wealth. She never once asked for anything except to be allowed to play her mother's music in peace. A broken sob escaped from somewhere in the crowd. Several women pressed handkerchiefs against their eyes. Even hardened politicians looked visibly moved. Tavian turned fully toward Siren. He reached into his coat and withdrew the velvet box she had first seen on the garden bench at Ashgrove Park. He opened it slowly. Inside rested a ring of breathtaking simplicity, a single diamond set in white gold, surrounded by tiny sapphires the exact color of the midnight blue gown she wore. It was not the largest or most expensive ring in the room, but it was the most beautiful, because it had been chosen with the same quiet sincerity that defined the man offering it. Siren Caldwell, Tavian said, his voice steady, but his eyes holding more emotion than most guests had ever seen from him. You taught me that honesty still exists, that kindness is not weakness, and that music can reach places inside a person that words and wealth never could. He paused. Will you do me the honor of becoming the Duchess of Aldenmore? The silence that followed lasted 3 full heartbeats. Siren's hands trembled. Tears spilled down her cheeks without apology or restraint. She looked at the man standing before her and saw everything she had once believed was lost forever. Love offered without condition, respect given without expectation. A future built not on status or strategy, but on the 2 things she had valued since childhood: love and music. Yes, she whispered, then louder, through the tears, strong enough for the entire ballroom to hear. Yes. The applause that erupted shook the chandeliers. 300 guests broke into sustained ovation while the orchestra launched into a triumphant waltz. Tabian slid the ring onto Saren's finger and pulled her gently toward him, while the ballroom around them transformed from silent shock into genuine celebration. Across the room, Lysara Fontaine turned and walked toward the exit without speaking to anyone. Briony pressed her hand against her mouth and looked at the floor. Anthea's eyes were red. Cressida stared at her former servant with a gaze that shifted slowly from disbelief through shame, and finally settled somewhere near grief for something she could not entirely name. Lord Cornelius stood absolutely motionless. Lady Lenora wept silently beside him, and in all the years Saren had known her, the tears on her face had never once been real until now. And they had arrived far too late. Years passed after that evening at Alden Moor. As Duchess, Saren Blackmere became one of the most admired women in England, though not for the reasons society typically admired duchesses. She opened the Alden Moor estate to local musicians, funding scholarships for gifted children from families who could not afford instruments or instruction. She established a charitable fund for widows and daughters of clergymen left destitute by circumstance, ensuring that no young woman would face the choice she had once been forced to make between love and survival. She treated every servant inside the estate with warmth and dignity, remembering each by name, asking after their families, and insisting that household staff eat the same quality of food served at the family table. People admired her because her kindness carried no performance behind it. She was simply who she had always been, only now the world was finally watching. Tavian himself transformed gradually beside her. The coldness that had defined him for years softened into something quieter and warmer, visible in the way he listened when Saren played piano in the evenings, in the way he laughed more easily during dinners with his mother, and in the way he sometimes stood in the doorway of the music room watching Saren teach their young daughter to place her fingers correctly on the keys, wearing the look of a man who understood precisely how close he had come to spending his entire life alone. Meanwhile, the Ashgrove sisters' carefully constructed lives continued unraveling. Lord Percival Vane abandoned Cressida publicly after a gambling scandal destroyed his remaining finances, leaving her isolated and humiliated inside a half-empty estate. Lord Rufus Ashby's political career collapsed beneath a corruption inquiry, dragging Anthea into a social exile she had never imagined possible. Sir Gavin Trelawney's controlling behavior worsened until Briony fled the marriage entirely and returned to Ashgrove Park with nothing but the clothes she carried and a silence where her confidence had once been. One gray winter afternoon, 3 familiar carriages arrived at the gates of Alden Moor. The women who stepped out were not the same women who had once mocked a servant for touching a piano. Their gowns were older. Their faces carried exhaustion instead of pride. Their voices, once sharp enough to cut through ballrooms, had grown quiet with the particular humility that only arrives after life has dismantled every false certainty a person once held. Saren received them inside the drawing room beside the fire while snow fell softly across the moors outside. Holloway, who had accepted Saren's invitation to join the Alden Moor household years earlier, served tea with a composure that betrayed nothing except quiet satisfaction. None of the sisters could meet Saren's eyes easily, but Saren offered them warmth, conversation, and the kind of generosity that does not require an apology to begin, because in the end, the greatest victory was never revenge. It was becoming loved for the very heart they once treated as worthless. And England eventually learned what the Ashgrove family discovered far too late. That true worth was never found in titles, wealth, or beauty, but in loyalty, kindness, and the courage to sit down at a piano when the entire room is laughing and play anyway.